Pozdrav. Vidim da su se 4 priključili, sad ću proslediti mail ostalima, pa polako da se i ostali priključe, pošto eto imali smo promenu, ja ću držati danas umjesto Nataše ponovo. Od ovih koji su se priključili, samo mi recite da li imate handout pred sobom? Hi. Znači, ponovo nam treba handout, pa bi bilo dobro da to svi odštampamo. Ja sam se priključio malo ranije, u slučaju da niste odštampali da mogu, i ako neko nema, da mogu da prosledim, pa da polako pripremite sebi handout, da li u odvojenom poslala profesorica. Odlično. Pa dobro, nije neophodno da imate i štampano, bitno da imate pred sobom, pa da li u odvojenom prozoru, uopšte nije problem. Ok, ima 13 ljudi, ja očekujem barem nekih 30-ak, nadam se da će biti, pa ćemo vidjeti. Sačekat ćemo koji minut. Ok, dok čekamo da se ostali priključe, kažite mi da li ima neko pitanje koje bi mogli da, o kom bi mogli da prodiskutujemo. A imali su čas prethodno, aha, u redu, sačekat ćemo. Tamo vam kažem, možete mi postaviti neka pitanja vezano za prethodno gradivo. Ja sam se dogovorio sa Natašom i prosledio sam vam da ja održim i neku vrstu online vežbi ove nedelje, to verovatno već svi znate, da uradimo sutra u terminu mojih vežbi, znači to je od 2:15 do 15 do 4, komentare na vežbe od prethodne nedelje. Znači svi oni koji su radili, a i oni koji nisu radili, da mogu da vide kako treba da se uradi svaki zadatak i da prokomentarišemo možda neke nejasne delove. Tako da ćemo to uraditi sutra i onda ćemo po ovom principu zapravo sa vežbama kaskati nedelju dana u odnosu na predavanje, što ja mislim da i nije loš sistem, da vi svaki put malo sačekate pa onda ponovite ono što je bilo prošle nedelje i da na taj način ćete bolje zapamtiti, duže će vam ostati svo to gradivo. Da, Angelina pita da li ću držati vežbe za sve grupe odjednom. Pa da, to je to. Neće biti to klasične vežbe u smislu da sad sve zajedno radimo kao što je to na fakultetu, kada je redovna situacija, nego će biti komentari vežbi. Ja ću vam poslati key, odnosno urađene zadatke, kako bih ja to recimo uradio, i onda ćemo da imate da sačuvate, a onda ćemo to sve prokomentarisati zajedno, to jest ja ću to još ispričati, malo pojasniti, nešto dopuniti i vi ćete imati prilike preko četa da postavite pitanja. Ako nešto konkretno vama nije jasno, a ja nisam obradio, da možemo onda o tome da porazgovaramo na samom online času. Znači neće biti dizajnera. Sad, što se Lenka pita za Skype, što se mene tiče, to nije problem, međutim, ja nisam siguran da može da Skype veza da podrži toliko vas odjednom. Ako vas je recimo 40-ak, ne znam da li je to izvodljivo, ali ja sam za, ako želite preko Skype-a, može i preko Skype-a. U tom slučaju bi trebalo samo da me dodate na Skype-u svi, ja mislim, pre nego što započnem konferenciju. Znači, ako želite preko Skype-a, ja sam za to i za tu opciju isto nije nikakav problem. Poslao sam u mailu moju Skype adresu, a i na prošlom času sam poslao u chat, tako da možete to koristiti. Ok, onda radimo Skype, ok, sutra ćemo probati Skype, onda važno. prednost YouTube-a je to što vam ostane snimljeno, tako. Znam da radite na drugim predmetima preko Skype-a, ja sam negde shvatio da vam je korisno da imate YouTube snimak. Aha, da napravimo grupu do sutra. U redu. Može da se snimi. Ok, super. Onda radimo Skype sutra, nema nikakvih problema. Odlično. Da li su vam bile teške vežbe koje sam vam poslao? Niko ništa, dobro, sutra ćemo to napričati. Nisu. Možda samo poslednja je bila teška. Da, pa već ste mogli primetiti da na vežbama dajemo tu poslednju vežbu kao nekakav bonus, da malo porazmislite i van onoga striktno što je pokriveno na času. Mada, ako govorimo pošteno, na prošlom času smo mi uveli, otprilike na samom kraju handouta smo uveli i taj deo priče o romanskim jezicima i selekciji pomoćnih glagola, tako da to nije bilo sasvim potpuno novo. Ok, sad je već počeo termin za predavanje, pa bih ja polako počeo sa radom. 21 učesnik streama, nije loše, može bolje, ali možda se priključi još poneko. Ok? Ja ću sad naravno preći na engleski, jer mi je tako lakše. Alright, so the title of today's lecture is Embedded Non-Finite Clauses and NP Movement. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about subjects, so the syntactic representations of subjects in non-finite embedded clauses. This is, of course, related to the story of the previous class when we talked about subjects in finite matrix clauses. So we explained how a subject that originates inside the VP moves to spec TP for reasons related to case theory. In other words, we said that the finite T head has the ability to license nominative case and nominative marked NPs in spec VP, then move to spec TP to get their case license there. So that was the story about finite subjects in matrix clauses, finite clauses and their subjects in the matrix domain. But we also have embedded clauses, and these clauses are of two kinds. And whether or not you're going to have a finite or non-finite embedded clause depends primarily on the verb you've selected. So this is fairly obvious, but that's illustrated in one. So just to clarify what we're talking about. So in the example in one, you have a sentence like, I said that I would explain the issue. That's grammatical, of course. And then in 1b, you have I said to explain the issue. This is, of course, ungrammatical. So in that case, the non-finite clause obviously can be combined with the verb say. But in 1c and d, so in handout there is a mistake. It should be c and d with the verb try. With that verb, you have the opposite situation, right? So you have I tried, that I explained, I would explain the issue, nothing really works, right? So we try. The only way you can get a grammatical sentence is by selecting a non-finite embedded clause, as in the final example. So I try to explain the issue. And on the surface, these examples tell us that say and try are simply two different verbs. Say selects a finite embedded clause with a complementizer that, and tries selects a non-finite embedded clause and rejects a finite clause with a complementizer that. In other words, we're talking here about selectional requirements of certain verbs, and you already know that verbs are simply different in the way they combine with arguments. Some of them select two NPs, so some verbs are transitive, they select an NP for their subject and then an NP for their object, and some verbs are intransitive, they just want a subject, for example, or in the case of unaccusatives that we discussed last time, they really want an object, but they can't case mark it, right? So you have simply, we are talking about certain inherent properties of verbs. And this story extends to the part where we're talking about the selection of clausal arguments. So we're talking about the selectional requirements of certain verbs with respect to finite and non-finite clauses. And simply certain verbs like say select finite clauses and certain verbs like try select non-finite clauses. So we are interested now in the analysis of non-finite clauses. How do we represent these clauses? So far we've only dealt with finite matrix clauses, but now we want to uh, lay out a syntactic analysis of non-finite clauses. So what's going on there? We can start by observing the non-finite sentences that we have. So in one, you have one example of a non-finite embedded clause, we try. So you have, I try to explain the issue. So what we can say about this non-finite clause in comparison to finite clauses is one, that it doesn't have a complementizer, right? So a finite clause like the one in 1a has a complementizer that. Non-finite clauses don't have that, right? So here in I try to explain the issue, there is no complementizer there. And you also don't have a subject in the non-finite clause. There is nothing, there is no overt item that plays the role of the subject in this sentence, as opposed to a finite embedded clause where you of course have the subject, right? So in I said that I would explain the issue, you have the overt subject I inside the finite embedded clause as well. So on the surface we have these observations and we need to make sense of these observations somehow. So we have to integrate them into the syntax, our syntactic representation of finite and non-finite embedded clauses. We are going to say that you have non-finite, that you have verbs like try, which select non-finite embedded clauses, which are structurally speaking CPs. So the argument is going to be that the verb try selects a CP of a certain kind with a non-finite TP inside. So this is the representation that we have in the bottom of this page here. So let's go through the representation here. So the sentence is, I tried to explain the issue, and the top part of the tree is what we are familiar with, right? So it's TP, and then you have the verb, the VP with the verb try. Now, in the complement position of this verb, you have a CP. And as you can see in the tree representation here, this is a CP with a null C head. In the complement position of this C head, you have a TP, which is non-finite. So the T head here is simply 2. So this two particle is a T head, which signals the lack of tense meaning, right? non-finite. We call it non-finite t-hat. And in the spec position of this non-finite t-hat, you have what we call pro, the null subject or pro. So that's the thing that we need to explain here. The new idea in this lecture is that you have a null subject in the spec of TP with non-finite clauses. So that's a new element. That's something that we are not familiar with at this point. The idea is that you have a null subject pronominal item, pro, which is not syntactically realized, which is not phonologically realized, but it's syntactically present in the spec of TP. Okay, so it's the subject there. And we're going to explain what happens with this element in this lecture. Okay, so if you turn the page. The reason we are postulating the existence of pro is because we have talked about our argument structure for verbs. Okay. Lenka is asking, a null subject is a subject in a non-finite clause. Yeah. So in non-finite clauses, we're going to say that you also have a subject, but the subject is not syntactically, is not phonologically realized. So it's syntactically present and phonologically unrealized. For the most part, the reasons why we're postulating these null subjects are theory internal. So we, on the one hand, right? So on the one hand, we have said that a verb has certain argument requirements, right? So if you're dealing with a transitive verb has to have two arguments, one in the spec of VP and the other one in the complement of the verb, right? So it has to have two arguments. And if you go back to the previous page and you take a look at the verb explain in the embedded clause, so this verb has the object, the issue, right? So the issue, the MP issue, is overtly realized in the V complement of the embedded clause. So that's fine. But this verb explain also requires an agent argument, the explainer, right? So it needs to have something in its spec VP. We know that because the verb explain can appear in matrix clauses. Like, I am explaining the point right now. So in matrix clauses, the verb explain, of course, requires a subject and, of course, an object. So here, if it appears in an embedded clause, it does have an object, but it seems like it doesn't have a subject. But it needs to have it, right? Also, we said that in English, spec TP position always has to be filled. We know that we can recall this point from the previous lecture. We said, yeah, so the idea about, so Stefan is asking, is pro phonologically null in all languages? Pro is by definition phonologically null. If it's not phonologically null, then it's not big pro. Okay, Stefan? So by definition, big pro is obligatorily phonologically null, but syntactically present. If it's not phonologically null, then it's not pro. So by definition, big pro is phonologically null. So this is an element we are introducing in order to explain the absence of subject in cases where we know that we expect a subject. And in embedded clauses in English, of course, we expect a subject because the embedded verb needs two arguments. And also, embedded TP needs to have its spec position filled. We know from matrix clauses that spec TP position always has to be filled. So even if the verb doesn't have an external argument, right? So even if the verb doesn't have an external argument, like rain, remember that example, we will still say it rains. And the syntactic explanation for this is that spec TP position has to be filled even if the verb doesn't have a subject. If the verb has, if the verb only has an argument in its complement position, that's the case with unaccusatives, and with passives, you will move that element from the V complement to spec TP. But if the verb is like zero place predicate, like rain, you have nothing that you can move to spec TP, and then you insert a pronoun it. So we know from matrix clauses that spec TP position always has to be filled. If the spec TP position always has to be filled, then in the context of embedded clauses, if we have spec TP, we still expect it to be syntactically filled. So we have two reasons to expect an element in spec TP in embedded clauses. One, the embedded verb still needs to have a subject owing to its argument structure properties. And the spec TP position of the embedded TP needs to be filled. Yeah, EP, the idea of EPP is precisely what we're talking about here. So the EPP requirement says you need to have something in the spec of TP. And so we are really committed to this idea, and that's the reason why we're postulating the existence of a phonologically empty element in embedded spec TP if you're dealing with a non-finite clause. Now, if you're postulating a phonologically empty element, you need to specify the syntactic conditions for its appearance, right? So you can't just say that you have phonologically empty elements all over the place. You need to have very strictly defined conditions for the occurrence of these empty elements. So that's what we're going to provide. So that's on the second page, this first part. So in the first part of this of the second page, we're going to say that the phonologically null subject appears in spec TP of non-finite T's. So if your non-finite T is deficient in terms of finiteness, it cannot license nominative case, and nominative case is the precondition for an element to be explicitly realized. This is part of the story in X-bar theory that's related to case to the entire story about case, where the idea is an MP can be phonologically realized only if it has its case licensed, right? So case licensing on MPs is a condition for it being phonologically realized. Non-finite T heads do not have the ability to license nominative case. And this is the reason why your subject in spec TP can't be phonologically realized, and it stays unpronounced in the form of big pro, right? So the story about case again says case needs to be licensed in order for you to be able to pronounce an MP. If the MP can't get its case licensed, it has to be phonologically null. So in that case, it's realized as pro. Yeah, what is EPP? So it's EPP, not EEP. Alexander asked that, and so I'm not sure if Natasha introduced. I think Natasha introduced that idea at some point, obviously, since Alexander knows about it. So the EPP is the empty position principle, which says that um, the spec TP position has to be filled all the time. Spec TP position always has to be filled, and it's related to this story that we told about um, uh, the it subject with it rains, right? So you always have to have something in the spec TP position of finite clauses, and then also by extension, something has to be present in the embedded TP as in the spec of embedded TP as well. Okay, so that's the idea behind the EPP principle. Okay. All right. So this is the argument. This is like the theoretical part of the story about pro. Pro is real. Pro is the null subject that's realized in the spec TP position of non-finite embedded clauses. Okay, and the reason why it's phonologically null is because non-finite TPs cannot license nominative case, and nominative case is a precondition for phonological realization. So that's the story. Now, what is the interpretation of this null subject? How does this null subject get interpreted? In the example, I tried to explain the issue. You have to explain who the subject of the embedded clause is. I tried to explain the issue. Who tried? I. Who is supposed to explain? I. Right? So even if you don't have a phonologically overt element in the spec TP and in the spec VP of the embedded part, right, the subject seems to be, so at least on the basis of that example, we know that the subject is going to be right. The subject is going to be the same as the matrix one, right? On the basis of that example. But remember, we can't make sweeping generalizations on the basis of just one example. With the verb try, seems like right. So and in the VP part, you have the trace of pro. That's obvious. So on the basis of this example, we try. We know that the subject of the embedded part gets the same interpretation as the subject of the main part. But will that always be the case? That's the question. If that were the case, you could just say that the subject of the embedded clause and the matrix clause is always the same and try to somehow formalize that on your tree. But it turns out that it's not always the matrix subject that gives you the interpretation for pro. Take a look at the example in 3 in the middle of the second page. So you have the example in 3a. I tried to explain the issue, which is the same as the one in the first part. And of course, the embedded subject is the same as the matrix subject. But in 3b, I persuaded him to explain the issue. Who is the explainer now? Of course, it's him, right? So I persuaded him to explain the issue. The whole point is for him to be the explainer. Okay? So it's not always the case that the subject of the embedded clause gets its interpretation from the subject of the matrix clause. Sometimes it will get its interpretation from the object of the matrix clause. What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate a little bit on that point, and then I'll address it. So we can say that we have subject control verbs and object control verbs. Okay? Subject control verbs are those verbs like try, where the subject of the matrix clause controls the interpretation of the subject of the embedded clause. These are subject control verbs. Once again, the subject of the matrix clause controls the interpretation of the subject of the embedded clause. But you also have object control verbs like persuade, where the object of the matrix clause controls the interpretation of the subject of the embedded clause. Persuade is an example of an object control verb, and try is an example of a subject control verb. So let's make a distinction there. Okay, yeah, we have to have a VP shell with double object constructions. That's for sure, right? So our analysis of object control verbs is definitely going to involve a VP shell, because the verb is simply has to have 3 arguments. But the existence of VP shell still doesn't explain this control phenomenon. How do we account for the interpretation of the embedded subject? Sometimes it comes from the matrix subject, and sometimes it comes from the matrix object. How do we formalize that? How do we give a rule? How do we formulate a rule that's going to give us the right results all the time? Okay. So let's turn the page. From the closest subject. Okay. That's going to be basically our explanation, that the closest subject is the one that assigns the interpretation to the embedded subject. But the question now becomes, what counts as closest? In the practice classes, while we still had real practice classes at the faculty, people in my group discussed the idea of closeness in syntax. We said that basically in language you never get linear measurements. You always refer to the tree when you're talking about distance and closeness. So if we say that it's the closest subject that assigns reference to the embedded subject, we need to say what counts as closest. So we're going to formulate a rule, right? The one that's higher in the structure. That's roughly what the rule that we are talking about is going to say. We're going to define a relation that's known as C command, categorical command. And the C command relation is a relation that's defined on the tree. And we're going to say that an element C commands another element if this other element is contained within its sister branch on the tree. This is very important. And if we had a blackboard now, I would perhaps do some drawing. But now we're going to have to do this only verbally. Categorical command, or C command, is a relation where an element A C commands an element B if and only if the element B is contained inside the sister of A. Do you get this? An element A C commands the element B if and only if the element B is completely contained inside the sister of A. So first of all, we know what counts as a sister in the tree. We know that. What is a sister in the tree? Yeah, for example, a complement. So the sister of B is the complement of B. Okay. And then, right. And the complement, so in other words, our C command relation can be defined as your element A C commands your element B if the element B is contained inside the complement of A. But a specifier of a certain phrase C commands the bar level of that phrase as well. Because the bar level of that phrase is the sister of the specifier. Do you get this? So if you have a specifier, or you have a spec VP, for example, spec VP C commands everything that's located inside the V bar, because the V bar is the sister of spec VP. Is this clear? So if you want to determine what is in the C command domain of a particular element, you simply go one node up and then down. If you are in the spec VP and you want to know which other elements are C commanded by the element that's in spec VP, you simply go one node up, that's VP, and then down, that's V bar. A spec of VP C commands everything that's in V bar. Everything that's in the V bar. So the control relation is going to be defined on the basis of C command by saying that the interpretation of pro is fixed by the closest C commanding referential MP. Okay? The interpretation of pro comes from the closest C commanding MP. And on our third page of the handout, we can illustrate this with reference to our object control verb persuade. So in the tree that you have on the third page, just to show where we are, right? But this is the third page, this large tree here. So here we have a representation of an object control verb. And as you're looking at the tree here, you can see that persuade is, of course, a double object construction. So it has two objects. You have a VP shell. You're familiar with the VP shell. We don't need to revise that part. So, of course, the subject of persuade, in this case, I, starts off in spec little VP and then moves to spec TP. In the big VP, you have the object of persuade, him, which is located in spec big VP. And then in the complement of the verb persuade of big VP, you have a CP, which is a non-finite CP with the null complementizer. Okay. And then you have a non-finite TP down below. And in spec TP, you have pro. With object control verbs like persuade, the interpretation of pro comes from the matrix clause object. And we have defined that on the basis of C command. Now let's see how that works in practice. Looking at the tree here in the handout, you start off at the position of pro in the spec TP in the embedded clause, and you ask yourself, what is going to give the interpretation to this element? And we said that the interpretation of pro comes from the closest C commanding NP. As we're looking at the tree, in the matrix VP, big VP, we have him, the pronominal element him, in the specifier. And we ask ourselves, does this pronoun him C command the object of the pro in the spec TP of the embedded clause? You take a look at this element him in spec VP. You go one node up and then down. You can see that pro is contained inside the sister of this NP in matrix V, in matrix spec VP. In other words, matrix spec VP him does C command this null pronominal subject, and it's the closest element that does so, which is why pro gets its interpretation from him. Okay, is that clear? So basically, in order to define the conditions for the interpretation of pro, you need to refer to the notion of C command. And C command says A C commands B if and only if B is contained inside A's sister. And then you just take a look at the tree. With object control verbs, the object of the matrix verb is the closest C commanding element, C commanding NP, which is why it assigns interpretation to pro. If pro gets its interpretation from the closest C commanding NP, so every node C commands the element in its sister node, or it's just specific explanation for pro. No, C command is a notion that we can now use for all purposes. C command is simply a structural relationship, and it just says every element A C commands every element B if and only if B is contained inside A's sister, and that's it. So you can, if you're dealing with a specific syntactic problem and it seems like the notion of C command can help, then we're going to use this notion of C command as a form of explanation. We will see that the C command relation is also used for the explanation of the interpretation of reflexives. So it's not only for pro. Now we have this relation, and we're going to use it as a mechanism for explaining all sorts of things. For example, the interpretation of reflexives as well. So pro, reflexives, all sorts of things which introduce variables, which have variable meanings. Okay, and C command is going to help us there. And think about it this way. So since we're going to meet tomorrow as well for practice classes, before the practice class, try to think of an example in which you have an NP, a referential NP, which is higher in the structure than pro, but it doesn't C command it. Okay? because C command is a very specific type of relation. It says A C commands B only if B is contained inside A's system. It follows then that certain element might be higher up in the tree, but it wouldn't C command necessarily a certain element. So for you, the task for tomorrow is to So I'm going to return to that example. So we need to find an example. Just a sec. So we need to find an example where an element will be higher than pro, but it wouldn't C command. So then it says, him I persuaded to help me. So here you have a simple relocation. So you are doing topicalization. And in that case, him still does have a trace in its original position. Okay, so in your example, Srejan, him still has a trace in its original position. So basically, the interpretation of pro here is the same, because him leaves its trace in spec big VP, and from there it C commands. It's the closest element that C commands pro in spec embedded TP. Okay, Sajjan? So yeah, here it seems, so on the surface in this example, it seems that him is further away from pro than I, but in reality, it still leaves its trace down below. So ultimately, it's still the closest element that C commands pro. But our task is to try to find an example where, so for tomorrow, where the NP is higher up in the tree than pro, but it doesn't C command. In that case, since our interpretation of pro is defined on the notion of C command, if the element is higher up in the tree, but it doesn't C command, it shouldn't be able to give the interpretation to pro. That's our hypothesis based on this theory. And your task is to try to check that hypothesis. Is it the case that a higher non-C commanding MP can't assign the interpretation to pro? If that's the case, our theory works. If that's not the case, the theory doesn't work. Okay? So don't just accept this at face value. Think about it critically. Okay. What happens when there is no higher C commanding MP in relation to pro? We have such examples. These are the examples in 4. So right in the bottom of the page. So in 4, you have 4a. To explain the issue seems difficult. To explain the issue was forbidden for B. Okay? These are non-finite TPs. And according to our story so far, they need to have a pro. Right? They need to have a pro according to our story so far. What is the interpretation of pro? Okay, yeah, so seems like this is a CP that's located in the subject position, right? According to our assumptions. Lenka, so I think, yeah, that's fine. Stefan, isn't this also topicalization? Yes and not. What would be the non-topicalized version of this? It would be something like, it seems difficult to explain the issue, right? So it's not right. But see here with what you have. So Stefan, it seems difficult to explain the issue. You have an extra element, it. So its topicalization is standardly analyzed as a movement to a position somewhere higher up than TP. What your example shows is that since this it alternates with the entire clause in the initial position, it seems that they are competing for the same spot. If that's the case, then to explain the issue should be in spec TP when it's the initial element. So it's not topicalization, it's movement to spec TP. Remember the previous story. You have a movement, which is movement to spec TP. This will be then a movement, and topicalization is standardly defined as non-argument movement. Movement to non-argument position, a bar movement. Movement to a position higher up than TP. Right. So this is not the same thing as topicalization, but it's similar to it. It's similar in its effect. Seems like you're doing this in order to somehow topicalize, but syntactically it's clearly not the same because it alternates with it. If I say his version of the story I like, this is a topicalization, and it doesn't alternate with it. So the unmarked version of that sentence is not it I like his version of the story. That's not the unmarked version. The unmarked version is I like his version of the story, and then I say his version of the story I like. See, Stefan, to get this? Okay, yeah, it's clearly different from topicalization, but it's also similar in a certain sense. Okay, cool. Yeah, Sajan. So that's what Lenka said as well. So on our standard assumption, this would be something like CP in the spec TP. Okay, but our concern here is with the interpretation of pro. If for the interpretation of pro we need an element, an NP that C commands it, what would be this element that C commands pro here? What C commands, which NP C commands pro here? Is there such a thing? So there is no NP that C commands it. Uh-huh. Surgeon says it's a CP that C commands it. Think carefully. To explain the issue, this entire thing, right? There is no C commanding here. There is nothing that C commands pro Stefan in this structure. But to return to Surgeon's point, the only thing that is higher than pro in this structure is this C part, CP, but there is no NP in this CP. To get the interpretation of pro, you need a C commanding NP. And clearly, there is no C commanding NP here. Okay? So what happens? Is the sentence ungrammatical? The sentence is grammatical, right? And what is the interpretation of pro? Of course, yeah. What is the interpretation of pro here? Who explains? Who is the explainer? Leica says we have an objective anyone, right? Yeah, right, anyone. So it seems like this sentence in which there is no C commanding NP in relation to pro, this sentence is still grammatical, but the interpretation of pro is generic, anyone, undefined. So if there is no NP that C commands pro, the sentence will not be ungrammatical. It's just that pro will get generic interpretation. Okay? Unless there is a referential NP that C commands pro, pro gets a generic interpretation. Okay? Clearly here the sentence is grammatical, but the interpretation of pro is generic, so we can say if there is nothing C commanding pro, pro gets generic interpretation. Let's turn the page. On the next page, we can see this quite clearly. So in the 3 in 4, you get the illustration for this. So this entire CP with pro, to explain the issue, is located in spec TP of the main clause. Seems difficult. And on this tree, you can see quite clearly that there is nothing that C commands pro. Okay? You take a look at which element can C command pro here, and as Sejan said, it's only the C head. If you take a look at C head and go one node up and then down, C head does C command pro, but C head is not an NP. Right? We need an NP that C commands pro to assign interpretation to pro. Since C head is not an NP, we can say we have no C commanding NP, and then we get this arbitrary sort of interpretation of pro. There is no fixed entity that's the subject of this non-finite clause. Arbitrary. Okay, so the conclusion here is that pro has an arbitrary interpretation unless there is an argument higher in the structure to control its reference. The closer argument that C commands pro determines its reference. Okay, and now I'm going to recap. So we started the story about non-finite embedded clauses and their subjects. The story ties back into the previous subject, which was NP movement into subject positions, and we talked about the assignment, the licensing of nominative case, and all of that. If we turn to non-finite clauses, we said that we still need to have a subject in spec TP because spec TP position needs to be filled. That's a syntactic condition for English, the EPP principle. And the embedded verb also needs its external argument, its agent argument. So we need to have a subject. But this subject can't be phonologically realized because we don't say it in the sentence. It's simply not pronounced. So what do? We say there is pro, which starts off in spec TP of the embedded verb and then moves to spec TP. What are the conditions for the distribution of pro? We said that pro is realized in the spec of non-finite TP because non-finite TP cannot license nominative case. And in order for an NP to be phonologically realized, it needs to have its case licensed. So since it can get its case licensed, it's going to be phonologically null pro. So this is the definition of the conditions for the distribution of pro. In other words, where can you find pro? Where you can find pro only in the spec TP of non-finite clauses. How do we define the interpretation of pro? Well, we said we need the notion of C command for that. Why? Because it's not always the matrix subject that gives you the interpretation of for pro. It's sometimes the object. And how do we? So we said it has to be the closest NP. But how do we define closest on the tree? We said we need the notion of C command there. So we said an element A C commands an element B if and only if B is contained inside A's sister. So an NP C commands pro if pro is located inside A's sister and NP's sister. And the closest C commanding NP is going to give the interpretation to pro. If there is nothing C commanding pro will get arbitrary interpretation. All right? And that's about it for this lecture. Your task is to try to apply before tomorrow, before the practice classes, will be to try to check the hypothesis that it's really C command that determines the interpretation of pro. And how do we check this? We try to find an NP that's higher up in the structure in relation to pro, but it doesn't C command. In other words, the pro is not contained inside the sister of this element, but this element is still somehow higher up. If we find such a structure, we will expect that this element will not be able to assign interpretation of pro. If that's the case, our theory works. If that's not the case, our theory has a problem. So that's something to think about before the practice classes tomorrow. Okay, questions? Thank you, Lenka. So I'm going to stop it here. And if you have any questions now, or if you think of any questions before tomorrow's class, please go ahead and ask them tomorrow, and think about the example that I think about the test that I defined for you. Okay. All right. See you tomorrow.